Castlevania debuted on Netflix in 2017, so I'm very obviously a bit late to the party, but ever since the show started, I have been dying to make a video on the first 2 seasons, what I felt were the most spectacular and engaging parts of the show. In order to make my longtime dream a reality, I figured I would do a character crash course on the big man himself, Dracula.
I am Vlad Dracula Tepesh, and I do not get many visitors.
Now, just to let you guys know, I had done a previous character crash course on Rattlesnake Jake from Ringo, but that video got fraudulently claimed and taken down. I will try to re-upload it, and maybe I already have with a very snarky title, but crap like that happens all the time on YouTube, and you guessed it, I don't get paid for videos that get blocked. So if the Lord so pulls you to contribute, it's the consistent income from all of you great people on Patreon that allows me to keep making content. I will put a link in the description below in case you want to help out. But this is not a charity ball, and I am not a beggar on the street. We are here to talk about vampires. Probably the best on-screen vampire of the last decade. This series' Character Crash Course is all about looking at individual characters and breaking down the components of what makes them so good. This way, you not only get a better appreciation of the writing that went into such compelling characters, you get a roadmap of perhaps how to replicate something similar in your own writing. Or maybe you just like to watch a grown man geek out over animated demons, who knows. In any case, this video will be an objective look at the narrative and writing choices used to create the King of Vampires. So, the first point of order for any character breakdown worth its salt is to pin down the character's type. And no, I do not mean that I'm postulating that Dracula is a psychic dark type. I mean, we need to look at the progression of how Dracula's character presents through the story. First, we will deal with static versus dynamic. Static characters are those that do not change throughout the course of the story. There is value in these characters as they can present a consistent worldview or moral stance that is impervious to temptation or the hardships of the conflict. But of course, static characters can be conversely disappointing because a character that does not change may become uninteresting or be viewed as simple. The opposite side of this is a dynamic character, one that does change from the beginning of their introduction to the end. This is where Dracula falls. We learn that he first hates humans and recluses himself in his castle. Then he falls in love with Lisa and learns the positives that humanity, family, and love can give. Then he becomes a misanthrope again and wages war against all of humanity, changing from beginning to end. Dynamic characters gain their power and interest through their character journey. In most cases, the conflict of any fiction presents a moral, ideological, or at the very least, thematic problem. Dynamic characters change during their attempts to overcome or respond to this problem, aka the conflict. And it is their changes that create the heightening tension and character growth, culminating in the climax. I am sure none of you need to be reminded of the phenomenal climax of Castlevania Season 2, but much of the power of that confrontation came from Dracula and the rest of the cast's journey to that point. Again, neither static or dynamic characters are objectively better than the other. Their effectiveness is based completely in how a writer utilizes them. Next, we can move on to Dracula's character complexity. Much like character type, there are 2 sides here. We will start with flat characters. These are characters whose motivations and goals can be understood at a surface level. Flat characters are most often utilized as side characters. This is because side characters usually only stick around long enough to effectively embody one character aspect, and really don't usually need any more than that. Think back to the mom that confronted Tony in Civil War. She was around for 2, maybe 3 minutes, and her entire character centered on the pain and anger she had at Tony for the death of her son. We don't need a deeper dive to contextualize it. Her son is dead, and she is pissed. On the other side, we have round characters. These are characters whose goals and motivations can only be fully understood by learning about their personality, backstory, weaknesses, or other defining character traits. This is where Dracula falls, though interestingly, it doesn't initially appear like that. For a large part of Season 1, Dracula seems to be a flat character that is very easily understood on a surface level. His wife is dead, and he wants revenge. Cut and dry. But as you move deeper and deeper through the show, you realize that Lisa's death was merely the catalyst to thrust Dracula into action, and there was a host of underlying feelings and wants that needed to be unpacked to fully grasp why Dracula was waging his war. But we will get to all that in a little bit. So the very basics of the character that we have established is that Dracula is a dynamic, round character. He changes during the course of the story and has complex motivations that must be explored to understand. But again, this is all the basic stuff. To fully break down why Dracula was so dang interesting, we can start to look at the writing choices made in the representation of his character, and his subversions of long-standing cliches. To start, Dracula's position in the narrative is most likely that of the antagonist. He created the conflict that all the other characters had to respond to and overcome during the course of the initial narrative. That is definitionally what an antagonist is. However, that then brings forth the question of why I said he is most likely the antagonist. Well, because writing is still subjective, there is an argument to be made that Dracula is actually the protagonist of Castlevania, the character in which the narrative conflict most singularly focuses on. In the same way that some people consider Thanos to be the main character of Infinity War, Dracula could be the protagonist of Castlevania's first 2 seasons. That is up for debate, and I can totally see both sides. What is not up for debate, however, is that Dracula is the focal character. The focal character stands at the center of the narrative itself and is the character for whom the audience is meant to pay the most attention to and have the most interest in. If we do think of Dracula as the antagonist, this is actually a very cool and rare moment where the focal character and the protagonist are 2 different people. Trevor Belmont is the protagonist, but the focal character, the character most important to the story as a whole, is Dracula. This is one of the reasons that Dracula was so compelling in seasons 1 and 2. He was treated as a main character through screen time, dialogue, and complexity. He stood not only as the source of the conflict for the narrative, but battled his own personal conflict that just so happened to spread out to others. And that personal conflict gets us into how aspects of Dracula's character combine to make him a subversion of age-old tropes. Dracula is inarguably a Dark Lord character. You might synonymously recognize this as the big bad evil guy, BBEG. This is a single evil being at the head of a massive, usually faceless and homogeneous army that threatens the very existence of the setting. Think Palpatine, Sauron/Morgoth, Ozai, and more. This character archetype has been around forever, and Dracula fits smoothly in it with his command of the hell beasts and wanton destruction of the entire world. But Dracula is also a tragic character. A tragic character is one that has largely positive and sympathetic traits, but due to an extremely traumatic circumstance, aka a tragedy, the character either loses their positive traits or adopts negative traits in order to cope with the despair brought on by the tragedy. Tragic characters come in all shapes and sizes too. Anakin Skywalker is a tragic character. Carl Fredricksen is a tragic character. Victor Fries is a tragic character. But a tragedy is not the only component to making an effective tragic character. Tragic storylines only work if they are understandable and, in the best case, relatable. Now, when I speak of understandable versus relatable, they are 2 different things. A character and their struggle is understandable when a viewer can readily accept the logic of why a character has reacted the way that they have, even if the viewer has not personally had any experience with the situation. I have never had a wife be murdered on the grounds of witchcraft, but I understand why Dracula would have such a visceral reaction to the death of his spouse. I sympathize with Dracula's position. That is understandability. Relatability is the viewer's ability to personally put themselves in the shoes of the struggling character. I have been depressed before, so I can personally relate to Dracula's emotional turmoil, at least on some level. I empathize with Dracula here because I share his experience. I lay all this out because, again, grasping the execution of understandability and relatability is the key to writing effective tragic characters. If a viewer can neither understand nor relate to the tragedy of a character, well then the tragedy and the ensuing reactions to it fall flat because they do not make sense and do not touch a viewer on an emotional level. But as I have said, Dracula is largely understandable and relatable, but the really cool part is how that narrative construction interacts with his archetype of the Dark Lord.
What have you done to my wife?
Do you remember the previous 3 Dark Lords I mentioned? Sauron, Palpatine, Ozai? Each of them hold the Dark Lord stereotype so well because they represent the very concept of evil. It's not just that the characters are bad, they embody the very notion of what evil is. There is no nuance, there is no arguing for the benefits of their position. So in effect, the protagonist's fight against them is a fight literally between good and evil. It is different than a dispute over outlooks or personal reasons. It becomes an ideological and philosophical confrontation. Dark Lords and their faceless armies are meant to be allegories and represent the evil and immorality in the world that we must face and overcome. But Dracula is not like this. He is an explicit subversion. He is a sympathetic, understandable Dark Lord who embarks on his journey of evil not for evil's sake, but because it is how he copes with the tragic circumstances of his character. Dracula's evil is not fueled by the traditional markers of a Dark Lord like greed or dominance. Dracula is fueled by a deep longing to die in order to free himself of anguish, but his despair also pushes him to take revenge on those responsible for his tragedy. This intersection of the Dark Lord archetype and the tragic character archetype create a seldom explored avenue for a highly violent, murderous character to almost have an endorsement from the audience to do what they do. As much as we may not want to admit it, we kinda want to see Dracula go through with his plan. This is the exact same thing that was done in John Wick and similar fictions. You establish the complexity and nuance of the character by showing their capacity for good and love. Then you show how evil people take away what they love. That way, when the hurt character wants to kill people in revenge, we as the audience are okay with it because they were evil and deserved it. In Castlevania, a lot of the humans are horrible, because in the real world, a lot of humans are horrible. But the exaggerated nature of fiction shines through in Castlevania by making humans abjectly stubborn, conceited, and confident in their evilness. The people that killed Lisa denied Dracula's existence to his face. I mean, he freaking appeared as a giant flaming effigy, and they would still not repent, feel remorse, or see the error of their ways. There are 0 redeeming qualities about these people of Wallachia, and even though Dracula is wrong to lump all of humanity in with them, his rationale is completely understandable. To him, no amount of fear, no display of power or control could keep the humans from committing atrocities like what he endured. So then he just says, screw it, they all have to die. They are far past saving or caring about. What the show did was somehow make us root for the Dark Lord, which is an incredible feat in and of itself. It creates a circumstance where we fight against ourselves in wanting to see Trevor, Sypha, and Alucard win, and on the flip side, also wanting to see Dracula get his revenge. It's a phenomenal way to invest an audience in a fiction with high-stakes conflict because it places investment on both sides of the conflict rather than just one. But in order to accomplish that, the narrative needed to keep us invested in Dracula, keep him sympathetic and understandable. And the show's method of doing this was always appealing to the goodness and hope buried inside of him. Dracula's personal conflict throughout the show was living up to the memory of his wife and her dying wish. Lisa wanted Dracula to forgive because she believed he had the capacity to.
Don't hurt them! They don't understand!
The tension of the show was if Dracula would actually give himself over to abject evil and despair, or retain the goodness that his wife saw in him. The show threaded the needle with this character journey by focusing on Dracula's relationship with Isaac and Hector. This was a perfect choice too, because the relationships played towards both sides of his struggle. On one hand, he trusts them above all others, and they are humans. They are living proof that Dracula's ideology about the worthlessness of humanity is false. Those closest to his heart have always been human. Conversely though, Isaac and Hector are remorseless misanthropes who hate humanity and couldn't care less if it survives. They reaffirm Dracula's position for his war whenever given the chance. And it's this struggle to both sides that keeps Dracula in tension. He wants to commit evil against humans, but he keeps relying on humans for support, sometimes even emotionally. The show does a great job of showing scenes with the antagonist at rest. This is a scene where the antagonist is not focused on progressing the conflict or standing in opposition to the hero.
Dracula. Are you still my friend?
Always.
Antagonist at rest scenes explore the personality and nuances of the character in order to make them more complex, understandable, and relatable. This all culminates with Dracula having to come to grips with his personal conflict in the climax. Where everyone else's conflict is focused on the world ending, Dracula's conflict is focused on losing the last little bit of himself that Lisa loved by succumbing to sadness and revenge. And what I think is so cool and a genius move is that Dracula has complete agency over his own change. No one forces him to alter his ways because no one can. Dracula, much like Rattlesnake Jake, is very nearly a force of nature character. Force of nature characters are generally comprised of two aspects. The first is that the character embodies a power that is beyond the typical scope of other characters. Secondly, and probably most importantly, a force of nature character cannot be controlled or reasoned with. In the best case scenario, they can only be aimed so their destruction hits a specific target. For the first point about being beyond the scope of other characters, I don't think I have to belabor this, but Dracula is an eyelash away from omnipotence. The show presents him with quite nearly limitless power and intelligence. Our main characters, some of who go on to defeat death itself, are playthings to the king of vampires. No being in the show, supernatural or otherwise, comes close to the power Dracula had. And for the second aspect, it's pretty clear that for 99% of the first two seasons, Dracula cannot be reasoned with or controlled.
Dangerous. Are you going to continue questioning me? Are you going to fight me?
He is single-mindedly on a genocidal path, and what is so cool about this on a character level is that typically powerful outside forces move a character on their journey so that they must adapt or fail. Most characters grow by having to overcome a higher power. Part of their ultimate transformation and self-actualization is owed to whoever stands against them. This is the traditional protagonist-antagonist relationship. However, in Dracula's case, no one can stand against him. There is no conceivable power in existence that can sway him from his path. He is lord of everything and basically has primal authority over the entire planet. But that is what makes his journey so compelling, because ultimately, he has to answer to himself. No one is going to push him in the right direction because he is immovable. No one can threaten him into positive action because he's indestructible. Dracula's journey and eventual conflict is about confronting himself. It's about his own personal responsibility and accountability to who he wants to be and who he is expected to be. Because sometimes in life, it is up to us to change. Sometimes there will be no snarky rival or great looming villain to spur us forward. Sometimes it is only us and our thoughts and our depression and our willingness to move forward through them rather than surrender to them. No one else can fight our emotions or our despair for us, just as no one could set Dracula on the right path but himself. For our heroes to beat him, he had to allow himself to be killed. And that is because seeing the room he built with Lisa, he recognized the folly of his ways and gave up his quest for vengeance. And because of that, he is not fully a force of nature character, because he can be reasoned with, even if the reasoning is with himself. But if anything, his inability to fit into a force of nature archetype smoothly is yet another subversion of typical tropes. It would have been very easy for the show to say, oh, there's some magical MacGuffin that's the one and only key to killing Dracula and we have to find it, and then have the heroes prevail in the end because they're on the side of good. But what the show does instead is blatantly demonstrate that the good guys were just gonna lose. For all their preparation and power and moral virtue, they were going to fail. Because the message here was not that good always prevails over evil, is that there is just as much responsibility on those enacting evil to stop as there is responsibility for those on the side of good to stand against them. Dracula, no pun intended, looms large over every aspect of the first two seasons of the show because it is his actions that affect every other character. But it was his personal journey that truly created the core conflict of the show, because ultimately no one could stop him other than himself. Dracula was a dynamic, round, tragic Dark Lord that constantly walked an enthralling tightrope of all-powerful wickedness and vulnerable sadness. Very few Dark Lords in fiction are presented as emotional and pained as Dracula, and fewer are even given the narrative opportunity for redemption and self-correction. It is no wonder that after Dracula died, the remaining seasons of the show were obsessed with bringing him back. It was his story, his actions, and his allure that created the compelling circumstances that brought us all in at the beginning. And now, hopefully, we all have a better appreciation for how Dracula really did put Castlevania on his back. Anyway, thanks for watching all the way until the end. If you like what you heard, leave a like, comment, and subscribe. Again, if you want to help the channel out just in case this video gets taken down too, check out my Patreon. I'll leave a link below. You can also check out my website and books down there too. As always, it was a pleasure, and I will talk to you all again soon.